You've played the roles, met the expectations, and done everything right. So why does it feel like something's missing? Welcome to the Unwritten Woman, a space for the woman who knows she's more than the life she's been given. I'm Crystan, author of Unlocking Authenticity, a journey from people-pleasing to empowerment. And I know firsthand what it's like to break free from the mold and start rewriting your story. Here, we have real conversations about unlearning, unbecoming, and stepping into the fullness of who you are on your own terms. So grab your favorite drink, get comfortable, and let's dive in. So last week in our very first episode, we talked about unlocking the box, right? And the box is really just a representation of where we try to hide all of our pain and all of our traumas and all the things that we just don't want to think about. We don't want to talk about it. We just want to just put it away. We don't want to experience those feelings anymore. And instead of dealing with it, because it's too painful to deal with it, we've filled that box. We've locked it away. We've put it in a corner. But that box is starting to spill over, right? And we talked about how we really need to get comfortable with the idea of unlocking that box, dealing with the things that are in there, and throwing them away. And so this week, I want to really talk about what those things actually created, right? And those things that actually got created out of that box and the things that have happened are called trauma responses, right? And I just want to preface this again, and I will say this probably every episode, is I am not a therapist. I am not a psychiatrist, a psychologist at all. I'm just someone that has had to go through this process and have come out on the other side. I'm still on a journey. I'm still on a journey of becoming this woman that I envision and who I expect myself to be. And so that's part of what this podcast is all about, right? But before we can get to how we become this woman, we have to actually talk about some of the things that we really don't want to talk about, right? Some of the things that really hurt us in the past. And, we have to deal with some of the things that happened to us, when we were children and when we were, in our formative years and, things that have added on to that as we've gotten older. So we're going to start with unlocking the box, which we talked about last week. And this week, we're really going to talk about what are we doing to unpack that box? And the first step in unpacking that box is identifying what are our trauma responses? Because once we can identify what our trauma responses are, we can begin to change some of our patterns. So I think anybody could probably go on Google or Merriam-Webster's dictionary and figure out what's the definition of a trauma response. So a trauma response is basically a learned reaction to a perceived danger or emotional distress. All right. It's our nervous system's way of saying, I need to protect you, so we're going to have a reaction. Even if the threat is actually gone, I still have to protect you. And what are we protecting ourselves from? I believe that what we're trying to actually protect ourselves from is the feeling that we felt that first time that thing happened, whatever that experience was, and the feeling that you had in that moment didn't feel good. And so our trauma responses are our way of kind of building up a defense mechanism, right? So that we don't go back into that emotion that we experienced. And last week we talked about how a lot of times we don't even really think about our emotions, right? We just focus so much on how we react. And that's what people focus on, right? Is how we reacted in the situation. When in fact, the situation isn't the problem. The person isn't the problem. The problem is the emotion that we are trying so hard not to feel. And so when we dig deep into our reaction or our trauma response and then start to think about what do I actually feel, that's really uncomfortable. And so sitting in that feeling, we don't want to do it. So what do? We go back to our trauma response. I think we really need to normalize the idea that trauma responses are not character flaws. They're not character flaws. They're just survival mechanisms. They're just protective mechanisms. They're just defense mechanisms. So instead of feeling sadness, I'm going to react with anger, right? Because that's what's going to make that person back up, right? Or that person's behavior, they're going to change that behavior because they don't want me to react this way again. Or so we think, right? But that's a whole different episode, right? But we react with isolation. Like, I don't want to be here anymore because I'm uncomfortable. But what am I really feeling? Is it fear? Is it sadness? Is it disappointment? Is it like, you know what? I'm tired of feeling disappointed with you. And so I'm just going to back up. I'm just going to walk away from this situation. I don't care that, we've been together for 10 years, right? I'm tired because this is this emotion that I just don't want to feel, and I'm out, right? Whatever the situation may be. The point that I'm making is that these defense mechanisms are not character flaws. And if we can identify them as defense mechanisms or trauma responses, then we can get to the root of, okay, well, what can we do to change that behavior, change how we react to these types of situations? So what are some examples of trauma responses? Well, I'm glad you asked that question. So we've heard it, right? We've heard of fight or flight. We've heard of freeze. And maybe we've heard of fawn, right? So those are the 4 trauma responses: fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. So I'm going to go through each of these and I'm going to kind of break them down a little bit more. So fight is really that, trying to be in control of the situation, being in the driver's seat of the situation. It's being very defensive, right? I'm going to argue back and forth with you. I'm going to argue you down. I'm going to argue you down. Okay. And we're going to go, I'm going to go until you back down. I am going to fight, and I'm going to fight, and I'm going to fight, and I'm going to argue, and I'm going to yell, and I'm going to cuss, and I'm going to do all the things. Sometimes it can come across as, oh, she's always lashing out, right? But she's always so aggressive. That's an example of a trauma response. What about flight? People who are avoidant because I don't want to deal with this situation, so I'm going to stay busy. I'm going to constantly be working 24/7, and I'm not going to be in a position to have time to deal with the thing. You disappear when conflict comes up. You literally run like, hey, I'm out of here. And we've seen it sometimes, right? When we look at certain like reality TV shows, we see the ones who are going to fight you down. They're going to argue you down, right? Or maybe even get physical. We see the ones who are like, oh, it's getting a little crazy. I'm out. They're not going to stick around. And I will be honest. I think of all of the 4 standard trauma responses, I think I'm definitely one that is going to flight. Peace out. I don't like the situation. I'm out of here. Y'all can have fun. Let me know how it goes, but I'm not finna stick around and be a part of this situation that makes me feel uncomfortable. I would rather not be a part of it. I would rather be somewhere else. I'd rather do something that's going to fill my heart with joy, right? And I'll rather avoid the situation or avoid the conflict than actually deal with it. Then we have freeze, people who just shut down, who get silent, they disassociate, they are emotionally unavailable, emotionally numb. So what that looks like is, people who feel overwhelmed, so they just do nothing. I mean, I've probably felt this way too, like where I feel so overwhelmed and all I want to do is just get in the bed, like put the blanket over my head and just act like nobody exists. Sometimes we get in those situations where we literally just shut down. We're not disappearing. We're just not talking and we're not going to engage. That is also a trauma response. And then we have those who would basically fawn. And what that looks like is people pleasing, right? It's constantly apologizing for things. It's constantly, doing what you think other people want you to do and being who other people want you to be, right? Abandoning yourself and prioritizing other people over yourself, saying yes to things you really don't want to do just so that you can keep the peace, and you're actually betraying yourself. And so the common trauma responses are fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. And again, are not a character flaw, but we use them as defense mechanisms to protect ourselves from actually addressing the thing that needs to be addressed, sitting in the emotion that we're feeling, because we're so afraid of feeling that thing that we felt in that experience that traumatized us. So here are some reasons why we stay in trauma responses. Mostly because they feel safe, right? For those of us who are fighters, right? For those who are fighters, like we feel somehow it's a false sense of security. I'm not going to lie. It is definitely a false sense of security, right? When we react out of anger, right? Because we think that, oh, if I react this way, then I'm protecting myself and people are not going to do the things that they do that cause me to feel this way, right? It's going to stop them from doing it. And that's not the truth. That's not the truth, right? And so what happens? You constantly are reacting in anger and you're constantly being labeled as angry, right? You're constantly being labeled as aggressive. And in reality, you're not, that's not who you are at your core. It's that you've created this tool to protect yourself and it's not really working, right? You're really, it's really hurting you. It's really hurting those around you even more, right? So it's definitely a false sense of security. Same thing with people pleasing. We think, oh, well, you know what? If I just keep doing what other people want me to do, like it's just going to be easier that way. I'm not really going to, I'm not going to ruffle anybody's feathers and everybody's going to be happy. And then you realize two things. One, you are miserable, right? And you're not happy and you're living a life that you think other people want you to live. But guess what? They don't even know the real you. So how do they even really like you? How do they even really love you? Do they genuinely actually care about you if you're only doing things to make them happy? Right? So they don't see you. And if they don't see you, they don't really know you. And if they don't know you, they don't really love you. They don't really care for you. And you can't really blame them. But the truth is, like, you're living a miserable life and you really feel very much unloved and unseen. And it's all because of this mechanism that you're using as this false sense of protection to avoid the things that you don't want to really deal with. That's why we tend to stay inside of our trauma responses. But again, like I said, it's really just a false sense of protection, a false sense of security that really leaves us feeling empty, tired, drained, miserable, unloved, unseen, unprotected, all of those things. So the very first thing we need to do is identify what our trauma responses are. So I want you to think of a recent argument or conflict that you had that made you feel triggered. And I shared one, in episode 1. If you want to go back to it, you can definitely go back and listen to it. But I shared one and it was pretty simple, right? But it was, I think, a good example of, something that happens that triggers an emotion. And immediately it's like, I don't want to feel this. And so I, in my flight, am going to say, you know what, peace out. I don't want to feel this way. And so you're not the one for me, or I don't want to feel this way. And so I'm going to go, do my own thing and I'm going to get out of here. I'm checking out. Right. And so I want you to think about like a recent argument or recent conflict, a recent thing that happened that triggered you. And I want you to think about what your instinctive reaction was in that situation. Then figure out like, what is your real trauma response, right? And I think that's going to help you to identify, are you a fighter? Are you a runner? Are you a track star? Like, what is your normal response when things happen that trigger you? Once you've identified your response, then the next thing is, okay, let's get to unpacking this box. And this is tough. This is very difficult. And if you have pen and paper that you can write some things down, I would encourage you to take note as I'm talking about this, because this is where you begin to really take some actionable steps. So the very first thing that you need to do is acknowledge the fear of revisiting that original wound. So I'll give you an example. I remember, and this is, I remember being a teenager and being told, why can't you be more like somebody else? And I don't want to think about that, right? Because it makes me feel inadequate. It makes me feel like I'm not enough, or I'm not good enough, right? And it puts me in this place of comparison. That's a wound, that's an experience that I don't want to talk about. I don't want to feel that again. Um but the interesting thing about it is that I feel it all the time. And it's not because people keep telling me, hey, you should be more like so and so, but it comes in waves. It's like, I'm on my job and dealing with imposter syndrome. And it's like, man, am I really good enough to be here? Am I really smart enough to be in this position? Do I have enough experience? Do I have all of the skills that I need to be in this position? And then I have to, do some work to get rid of that negative self-talk. But the truth is, like, that imposter syndrome didn't start at the time that I, stepped into corporate America. That imposter syndrome didn't start when, I was married and, was having these feelings of inadequacy, right? It didn't start there, right? The earliest memory that I could think of where it could potentially have started is when I was told you should be more like this other person. That's probably the earliest memory, right? Of feeling that feeling. I would never know that unless I actually sat in the feeling and then think back to, and I said this last week, think back to the very first time that I recall feeling this way. And it's a difficult situation. It's a difficult process to go through. It's a very difficult process to go through. It's a very difficult step to take. But you have to be comfortable with acknowledging that you're afraid to go back to that original wound. You're afraid to go back to that original event that occurred that traumatized you, right? That has ripple effects 20, 30 years later. We have to be comfortable with the idea that in order for us to become who we want to be or rewrite our story, we have to go back and we have to acknowledge that, you know what? My reaction in these situations doesn't come out of thin air, isn't unwarranted, actually. And it comes from something. In order for me to change my patterns or create new ones, I have to go back to that original wound. And I'll tell you what, you might think just because that wound was from 20, 30 years ago that it's closed up. It is not. It has not healed. It is not healed. What you've been doing for the last 20 or 30 years is changing out the dressing, adding a new Band-Aid, right? When the blood seeps out, all you're doing is just changing the dressing, but it actually has not healed. And how do we know that it has not healed? Because of the way that we respond out of trauma. And so in order for us to heal, we've got to dig out all of that infected area. We've got to clean it up. And that means getting comfortable with the idea that, hey, in that process, it's going to sting. It's going to sting. I'm going to have to put some alcohol on there. And you know how alcohol is on an open wound. It's going to burn. But that burn is like, you can't even be mad at that burn because that burn is what I know tells me that it's actually working and it's going to heal. And it's going to heal well. And so the truth is that original wound has never healed, and we got to get in there. We got to clean it up. So some things that we can do for it to be less painful are things like journaling, right? Taking note of the things that you are actually feeling. And then we need to do some mindful reflection. We need to be doing some reflection. And I think that's part of what this whole thing is. But if you think about it, right? In those moments, how does my body feel? Your body is actually telling you how you feel. Making note and reflecting on how you physically feel in those moments when you're triggered is going to help you a lot. And it's hard. It's a hard task to do. My advice to you is to not just rush through this episode and move on to episode 3 when it comes out. Take the time and actually do this work. Getting to the root, cleaning up that wound, unpacking that box that we've unlocked. Because you can unlock it and leave everything in there. You got to unlock it, but then you got to unpack it. All right. And this is the unpacking of the box. If today's episode spoke to you, don't keep it to yourself. Let's keep this conversation going. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. And if something in this episode made you think, feel, or reflect, I want to hear about it. Drop a comment, send me a DM, or even share this episode with someone who needs to hear it. And who knows, your comment or question might just inspire a future episode. Because this space isn't just about me, it's about us rewriting our stories together. So let me know, what's on your mind? What part of your life feels unwritten? I can't wait to hear from you.